Console emulation. Most gamers have seen or used them at some point in time. For those who are unfamiliar, a console emulator is a computer software that is designed to imitate console hardware and behavior and run software based on it. From the gaming industry's point of view, their use is generally frowned upon, even to the point of being considered online piracy. To be fair, video game companies put lots of effort into making top quality games, some more than others, so the consumers can buy them and creators can earn profits from it. Console emulation has always been in that gray area between the free software movement and online piracy. It should be noted that using an emulator is technically legal, yet downloading ROMs from an unauthorized source is not, unless you own the original copy. Emulation has been a source of controversy ever since it boomed in the early 2000s. But what caused this resurgence of last generation games? Well, first off, let me point this out from my perspective. Nintendo and Sega were the two top companies that were duking it out during the 5th generation console war and were moving on to stronger, faster, and better hardware. The Super Nintendo was being pushed aside in favor of the Nintendo 64, and the Sega Genesis/Mega Drive, along with all of its crazy add-ons, was being replaced in favor of the Sega Saturn. During this time, the Sony PlayStation made its debut in the video game market after an infamous and nasty falling out between Sony and Nintendo. While companies were focusing on bigger and better graphics, replacing sprites and pixel art in favor of 3D rendered polygons most of the time, their previous consoles from the 3rd and 4th generations were considered obsolete since their life cycles have already ended. So what helped bring back these games to the spotlight? Simple: nostalgia. On the one hand, you had consumers who were involved with current generation games and consoles, while on the other hand, you had old school fans that preferred the classic games out of nostalgia and better replay value. It was also during this time that personal computers had progressed to the point where it was possible to replicate the behavior of some of the earliest consoles through software, and the first unauthorized non-commercial console emulators appeared. These early programs were often incomplete and very buggy. Since manufacturers didn't publish technical hardware specifications very often, programmers and developers figured things out through reverse engineering. Now, what is reverse engineering? Well, think of it this way. It's like taking something apart, like a toy or a computer, just to figure out how something works on the inside. In this case, Nintendo's consoles and handhelds tended to be the most commonly studied, from the NES up until today's generation of gaming. Console emulation became a form of free publicity and helped reintroduce older games to a new audience, even though they were obtained illegally. Not only did it bring back old games to the public eye, but it also introduced rare and obscure games that were never released in certain regions due to licensing issues, among other things that prevented localization. It opened the door to foreign video games and even exposed North American gamers to Nintendo's censorship policies. This rapid growth in the emulation also spawned ROM hacking and fan translation of games. Now, let's touch upon the legal aspects of emulation. You see, during the early 2000s, when the internet was like the Old West, in a sense that you could get away with anything, emulation got to a point where it was used and abused. That led to online piracy concerns. The video game industry began seeing console emulation as a threat because it could potentially hurt their sales revenue after noticing that their software was being distributed more and more online and for free. The companies have taken action regarding these events, and it got to a point where Sony even filed a lawsuit in 2000 against a company named Connectix Corporation over the Virtual Game Station, which was a PlayStation emulator, alleging copyright infringement as well as violations of intellectual property. However, the US court eventually ruled that the copying of a copyrighted BIOS software during the development of an emulator software does not constitute copyright infringement, but it's protected by fair use. This case helped establish that emulators are legal within the United States. After that case was settled, Sony purchased the emulator's rights from Connectix, discontinued the product in 2001, and Connectix itself closed in August 2003. Now, technically speaking, fair use is the idea that it should be okay for a person to reuse something that another person has created, in certain amounts and for certain purposes, without breaking the law. For example, if a consumer buys a product from a company, technically speaking, the consumer can do what they want with it as long as it doesn't infringe the company's copyrights. Now, just to point out, I'm no lawyer, I'm an engineer. The way I see it, censoring hardware and software related topics like console emulation, reverse engineering, data mining, ROM hacking, fan translations, and modding would be like censoring free speech and the freedom of knowledge. The latter three would be considered transformative works and are normally protected under fair use. Yet cease and desist orders from the original intellectual property holders have surfaced on occasion, even to this day. The video game companies, noticing the popularity of emulation, eventually used it themselves to re-release older titles in other platforms in order to fight off piracy. Interestingly enough, if it wasn't for emulation, the main console developers would have never created digital distribution networks in order to legally sell their games online to new audiences. That and backwards compatibility would have never caught on like it has today. In the past, there were attempts from console developers to fight off piracy in order to control their markets in certain regions, from using lockout chips inside cartridges to region locking, and even going as far as using mini DVD formats. But no matter what methods are used, programmers always find ways to circumvent this through reverse engineering. Another reason for console emulation is the preservation of old and current generation games. Let's say, for example, if you own the original game, be it a cartridge or a disc, and it got damaged at some point in time, the only logical backup would be a digital version, and maybe in 100 years from now, these games might not be playable at all. So through emulation, we are also able to preserve these type of games, in case that the physical software deteriorates over time. Now, I should also point out that console emulation isn't always perfect. Not all games are completely playable through emulation. From minor glitches to game-breaking bugs, some games can't be thoroughly played due to hardware or software limitations, or in some case, badly dumped ROM files that render the game unplayable. This is mostly due to the archaic hardware development of certain consoles that made programming and porting certain games rather difficult. In those cases, there's no other alternative but to get the original game instead. Speaking of which, emulation also sparked renewed interest in owning classic games and consoles. Many video game enthusiasts these days have huge collections of video games, which was possibly influenced by emulation itself. But then again, that's kind of debatable. In a sense, playing a game on an emulator, it's almost like borrowing a friend's game for a brief period of time. And if a game is really good, or if you prefer using the original controllers instead of a keyboard, that person can choose to get their own copy of the game, whether it's used or new. As stated before, console emulation is a gray area at times, and you could argue that emulation in some ways helped the industry. However, if for whatever reason you cannot buy a physical copy of the game where you live, be it because it was banned due to political or cultural differences, emulators should be considered a last resort. But please, if you do have the money for it, I recommend you buy the original hardware and software. You'll do the industry a huge favor. This has been Hadouken Dude. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content. Take care.